On a late November afternoon, as the light was beginning to drain from the water, they gave Delaney Marsh exactly two choices: sign a notarized statement admitting she had invented the whole story about Emmett Kane, take $2 million, and be out of the state before sunrise, or stay where she was and let the tide decide for her. Steel cuffs closed around her wrists, chained to a cast-iron mooring post that had stood on this abandoned ferry landing for 100 years, slick with moss, groaning softly every time the current pushed against it. The cold water had reached her knees and was rising inch by inch, patient as a man who knows he doesn't need to hurry. On the pier, beneath 3 sets of truck headlights aimed straight down at the black water, Arthur Devlin stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gray vest buttoned to the top, speaking in the voice of a man reading back the minutes of a meeting. "Sign it, Miss Marsh, and this ends right now." He was hiding nothing from anyone. The entire night shift from Berth 4 had been brought down there at the start of the afternoon under the pretext of an inventory count. Phones surrendered at the gate under the very security policy he himself had signed 2 years earlier, and 40 people stood in a line along the edge of the pier: the dockhands, the drivers, the office staff who had eaten the pastries she brought in every Friday morning. Devlin needed them there. If she signed, he had 40 witnesses to say she had willingly admitted she'd lied. If she refused, he still had 40 witnesses to say she'd been offered a way out and had chosen to stay. No one drew a weapon. No one pushed her into the water. There was only the water, and water is not a murder weapon. Not one of those 40 people lifted their head. What Devlin didn't know, what no one on that pier knew, was that Delaney Marsh had not invented a single word of it. 3 years earlier, at an hour when the city had not yet woken, at a registry window in Boston City Hall, she had signed her name beside Emmett Kane's on a marriage certificate, with 2 witnesses and a ring 2 sizes too big for her finger, a ring that still hung on a bootlace beneath her soaked shirt, pressed against the one place on her body the cold had not yet reached. And what Delaney didn't know was that at that very moment, 400 yards across the channel, a car was slowing to a stop at the barrier of a rising drawbridge. The man behind the wheel had driven 900 miles without sleep to come back to her. He looked across at the far bank, saw white beams pouring down onto a ferry landing that should have been abandoned years ago, saw a line of people standing motionless, and saw one small figure out there in the current. He didn't know who it was. The bridge came down, and Emmett Kane drove straight through and on toward the city with no idea that he had just driven past his own wife. Delaney had 6 hours, and in those 6 hours, she would come to understand something colder than the river itself. The real question had never been whether she would survive, but what she would leave behind before the water closed over her head. If this story reached you tonight, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with whoever came to mind just now, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with Delaney. Devlin never raised his voice again. He opened the leather briefcase resting on top of the truck cab, took out a sheet of paper that had faded to a pale yellow, clipped it to a stiff backing board, and handed it to Elias Stroud. Stroud waded down the moss-covered stone steps, held the board just high enough above the water, and extended it in front of Delaney the way a waiter might offer a menu to a guest in an empty restaurant. She didn't want to look, but the headlights shone directly onto the page, and there are some things the human eye reads before the mind has time to refuse. On the first line was the name of an insurance company she had typed into hundreds of letters. On the second line was a name: Rosalind Teague, Chief Accountant. Place of employment: Kane Harbor Holdings. Cause: fall from the edge of the loading dock during the night shift. Date: 2 weeks earlier. Beneath that was the claims examiner's signature, the pen stroke trembling slightly on the final letter, the kind of tremor that belonged to someone who had signed too many papers just like this one over the course of a lifetime. Below it was a statement confirming that payment to the beneficiary had been completed, accompanied by a file number. And in the upper right corner, stamped in red ink, was a brief line noting that the company had sent a condolence wreath. Delaney read it all from top to bottom. Then she read it a second time, more slowly, as though the letters might rearrange themselves into a different name if she looked again. They didn't. The water had risen halfway up her thighs, and the mooring post was groaning softly behind her, but for one moment she could no longer hear it. She was hearing another voice, the voice of the woman with salt and pepper hair who had removed her glasses in the deserted accounting office, laid them on top of a stack of papers, and looked directly into Delaney's eyes before asking her a single question. It was the question that had divided Delaney Marsh's life into everything that came before and everything that came after. And the woman who had asked it, the only person in that entire building with 30 floors who had ever looked at her as a human being rather than a title on the payroll, now lay beneath a pale yellow sheet of paper, bearing a claims examiner's signature and a wreath sent by the company. She remembered Roz's hand closing around hers that night. It had been cold, the knuckles slightly swollen with arthritis, but its grip had been strong. She remembered the one thing Roz had told her to do, and she remembered nodding. She hadn't known it would be the last time. On shore, Devlin waited for her to look up. He didn't hurry her. He understood perfectly well that what was doing the work now wasn't anything he could say, but the seconds of silence that followed after someone finished reading. Then he spoke, and his voice truly sounded sorrowful, with a sadness so natural that all 40 people standing along the edge of the pier must have believed it was real. He said the pier was dangerously slippery, that the moss grew thick during the colder months and no one was willing to spend the money to restore the surface that prevented people from slipping, that he had proposed it at 3 consecutive meetings, and no one had listened. He said Mrs. Teague had been a devoted woman, that she worked too late, that he had often reminded her not to remain there alone after everyone else had gone home. Then he ended with one short sentence, letting it fall onto the black water the way someone might drop a pebble to measure the depth. People are often careless, Miss Marsh. No one on shore moved. No one asked why a workplace accident report happened to be inside the legal counsel's leather briefcase that particular afternoon, brought to this particular abandoned ferry landing, and held before this particular woman while she stood handcuffed to a mooring post. No one asked why he knew its contents so thoroughly that he didn't need to glance down. Some questions are cold enough merely to think about, and it was already cold enough on that pier that day. Stroud drew the board back and turned away. Delaney watched as the pale yellow paper was returned to the leather briefcase, and she understood that she had just been shown a promise. Not a threat, a promise, set down plainly on a standard form, complete with a signature, a file number, and full insurance payment. This was how the story would be recorded. This was how her name would remain in a company's files. Neat, legitimate, and never worth reading twice. She lifted her head. The headlights shone straight into her face, forcing her to narrow her eyes, and she could no longer see Devlin clearly, only a gray silhouette standing with his hands clasped behind his back against the white glare. She thought of that cold hand with its slightly swollen knuckles. She thought of what Roz had told her. Then she pressed her lips together, and she didn't sign. Devlin showed no disappointment. He put the leather briefcase inside the cab, brushed his hands together ever so lightly as though dusting off chalk, then turned to the assistant standing behind him and told him to bring the timekeeping log for the night shift at Pier 4. The book was brought over, its blue plastic cover worn at the corners, the kind of log every crew supervisor in the company used, and no one had ever noticed. He opened it, found the page bearing that day's date, then stepped down from the concrete ledge and began walking along the line of people stretched beside the edge of the pier. He moved slowly, holding the book in both hands at waist level, his voice still that of a man reading back the minutes of a meeting. He stopped before the first person in line, a young man with closely cropped hair who worked on the loading crew, and called out his full name, including his middle name, exactly as it appeared in the book. Startled, the young man answered yes. Devlin looked down at the page, then asked him clearly, neither quickly nor slowly, a single question. Did Miss Marsh ever tell you that she was married to Mr. Kane? The young man swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward the water for no more than a fraction of a second before dropping back to the toes of his shoes. He said no. Devlin nodded, made a small mark in the column beside his name, and moved on to the next person. The second person said no. The third said no. The fourth answered a little louder than necessary, with the kind of raised voice that belonged to someone who wanted this over as quickly as possible. The fifth person merely shook his head, and Devlin had to remind him that he required a spoken answer, so the man said no. The sixth person, the seventh, the eighth. The pencil moved steadily across the paper, and between each name came a brief pause of exactly the same length, neat and measured, like water dripping from a sheet metal roof into an oil drum. The ninth person, the 10th. Then Devlin stopped before a broad-shouldered man wearing a wool coat faded at the elbows, his large hands hanging straight at his sides. He called out the man's name, Hollis Bray. The man answered yes, his voice hoarse. Devlin asked the same question again without changing a single word. Did Miss Marsh ever tell you that she was married to Mr. Kane? Hollis Bray didn't answer at once. He drew in a breath and held it in his chest for one beat too long, and in that silence, Delaney saw his two hands close and then open again. He was a longshoreman who had worked at this pier for 15 years, a man everyone on the crew knew was incapable of lying, not because of any moral principle, but because his face couldn't conceal a thing. Then he said no. He said it softly, and when he had finished, he turned his head to one side and stared into the darkness beyond the reach of the headlights, where there was nothing at all to see. Devlin marked the book and continued. The 12th person. The 13th. The line behind him grew longer, and the names followed one another like beads being counted in the dark. Each bead another no. Each no making the one before it seem a little more certain. By the 20th person. No one hesitated anymore. By the 23rd, someone answered before Devlin had even finished asking the question. The water rose to Delaney's waist, and she stood there listening as the roll call flowed toward her like a second tide, slower, colder, with no shore anywhere to cling to. Then Devlin stopped before the 27th person. He didn't need to look down at the book to read this name. Bernadette Fallon. The 63-year-old woman stood near the end of the line, clutching her handbag tightly against her stomach with both hands, her silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, wearing the gray cardigan everyone in the building recognized. She was the woman who had sat across the interview table on the morning Delaney walked into that building for the first time at 19 years old, carrying a cloth bag and with nothing to write in the section marked work experience. She was the one who had said, "All right, child, you can start on the night shift, and we'll see where we go from there." She was the only person on all 30 floors who called Delaney by her first name, not by her position, not by her last name. Devlin asked her the same question he had asked the 26 people before her. Did Miss Marsh ever tell you that she was married to Mr. Kane? Bernadette Fallon answered no. Her answer was clear and steady, and she didn't look up. She stared at the wet concrete in front of her shoes, and remained that way until Devlin had passed her by. The 28th person. The 30th. The 35th. The pencil continued making its marks, steady and even, until the final name. 40 names. 40 answers of no. Devlin closed the book with the blue plastic cover, tucked it beneath his arm, then turned toward the water. He didn't need to come any closer. He spoke just loudly enough for all 40 people to hear, in the almost gentle voice of a man who had just completed a necessary procedure that no one had wanted to perform. There, you see, I'm not the one saying you're lying. They are. There came the sound of heels striking wet concrete, a sound that didn't belong at the harbor, sharp and even as it traveled from the row of trucks down toward the water's edge, and all 40 people standing in line heard it before they saw the person making it. Camille Devlin stepped through a puddle without once looking down at her feet, carrying a leather-bound checkbook in one hand and a fountain pen with a silver cap in the other. She walked straight to the old electrical box beside the edge of the pier, brushed its lid with the back of her gloved hand, then set the checkbook down squarely upon it, as though placing a cup of tea on a tray. She laid the pen horizontally beside it. For several seconds, she said nothing. She merely stood looking out at Delaney, while the headlights shining from behind her traced a line of white light around her hair. Then she spoke, her voice soft, almost intimate, the voice one uses when explaining something simple to someone who insists on making it more complicated than it needs to be. She said the affidavit was her father's business, but this was hers. She said the check had already been signed on the line below, and all that was missing was a number. Then she delivered the sentence she had prepared in advance, and Delaney knew at once that it had been rehearsed because it fell too neatly into place. Fill in the amount yourself. Any amount. My father says everyone has a number, and he's never been wrong. No one on the pier moved. The water had risen above Delaney's waist, and the cold had passed beyond the stage of stinging pain into heaviness, the stage when a person's arms and legs begin to feel foreign to her own body. She looked at the checkbook on top of the electrical box, then at Camille, then said that she needed one wrist freed. Camille nodded to Stroud. Stroud waded into the water, inserted the key into the lock, released her right wrist, and left the cuff fastened around her left. He held out the checkbook and the pen, supporting them with a piece of stiff cardboard beneath. Delaney took the pen. Her hand was so cold that it took her a moment to close her fingers around it, and she felt them trembling to a rhythm of their own now, no longer obeying her will. All 40 people on shore were watching. It was the first time that entire afternoon they had raised their heads together. She set the tip of the pen inside the blank space for the amount, and she wrote a 0. Only one, round and slow, slightly misshapen where the circle closed because her hand was shaking. Then she lowered the pen to the line for the payee, the line where she would ordinarily have written her own name, and there she wrote 3 words. Separate, clear, and even more slowly than she had written the number. Delaney Marsh Kane. She handed the pen back to Stroud. Then she lifted her head and looked at Camille, her voice hoarse from the cold but not quiet in the least. She said Camille was half right. Everyone did have a number. Hers was 0, because 0 was all she'd had on the night he found her on the 30th floor, and he had stayed anyway. The pier was so silent that the water could be heard lapping against the foot of the mooring post. Camille Devlin didn't answer. She lowered her eyes to the checkbook, looked at the 0, then at the name written beneath it, and over the span of 3 breaths, her face changed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't contempt. It was the expression of someone who had just realized that the thing she had brought to buy another person had not only proved useless, but had been turned against her and used to give her an answer. All her life, she had lived by the belief that everything had a price, and no one had ever broken that belief in front of 40 people before. She closed the checkbook with one crisp motion. Then she straightened, turned to Stroud, and spoke in a voice that had regained every trace of its flatness. She said this mooring post was too shallow. She said that if Miss Marsh wanted more time to think, then they should give her somewhere truly quiet to do it. She told him to take her out to the far post, where the channel ran deep. Stroud glanced toward Arthur Devlin, who stood beside the truck cab. For a moment, he neither spoke nor gave any signal. He merely looked at his daughter for a long time, with the gaze of a man who had just heard something in that familiar voice that he himself had taught her, but had never meant to teach her quite so well. Then he turned away and let it happen. 2 of Stroud's men waded into the water, unlocked the cuff from the old post, and led Delaney along the submerged stone steps toward the outer channel, where the waterway widened and the surface changed from muddy brown to black. The water rose with every step she took. Behind her, the 40 people onshore lowered their heads again, and 400 yards across the channel, the lights of the city began to come on, calm and distant, knowing nothing at all. 8 years earlier, in that very same building, but seen from the inside and from high above, Delaney Marsh was 19 then, newly released from the foster care system with a cloth bag, and the first job they gave her was the night shift on the 30th floor. The 30th floor was only half finished at the time, the row of offices on the east side still covered in tarps, and the entire stretch of terrazzo flooring that ran for 130 feet from the elevators to the glass wall at the end of the corridor belonged to her alone from midnight until the first light of dawn. She pushed a chemical cart with squeaking plastic wheels along its full length 3 times every night, and the glass wall to her right was always pitch black, because there was nothing in the harbor below to give off light, except a few lamps at the ends of the piers and their trembling reflections on the water. At night, an empty building made sounds all its own, the ventilation system breathing out and then drawing in, the elevators returning by themselves to the lobby when no one had called them, the glass making a faint clicking sound as it expanded whenever the wind shifted over the harbor. People told her she would get used to it in time. Delaney didn't. She did what her mother had once done, the thing that had followed her from a little kitchen filled with the sound of boiling water and a stack of half-folded towels, the thing her mother had explained in one simple sentence, that if you whistled, the room didn't feel quite so empty. So she whistled. Not loudly, only enough for her own ears. A slow melody that rose and then fell very gently at the end of each phrase, a tune no one had ever named, and one she had never heard anyone else sing. She whistled it while rinsing the floor, while changing the water, while wiping fingerprints from the glass, and for 3 months the building listened without ever answering, until the night it rained. That night, she was halfway down the corridor with her back to the elevators, both hands gripping the mop handle, when she heard footsteps. They weren't the footsteps of a security guard making his rounds, because the guards wore rubber-soled shoes and walked very quickly. These footsteps were slow and steady, and they stopped somewhere behind her. She hadn't had time to turn around, because at that very moment, from the darkness behind her, someone whistled the next phrase. The exact next phrase, the right rhythm, the right lingering note, the same low interval her mother had always dropped into before the ending. And Delaney, without time to think, without time to be afraid, without time to remember who she was or where she was standing, whistled the following phrase in reply. It came out of her like a reflex, the way a person answers a greeting she has heard all her life. Then the entire corridor fell silent. She turned around. The man stood about 10 paces away beneath the only light still burning in the row of night lamps, the shoulders of his dark wool coat wet from the rain, his black hair plastered to his forehead. She had seen him twice before, both times from a distance, both times as he crossed the lobby, and every conversation in the room fell silent at once. She knew she ought to apologize. She knew she ought to say something about making noise while she was working, but she couldn't speak, because his face didn't look at all like the face of a man about to reprimand someone. He was staring at her the way a person might stare at a door that had suddenly opened in a place where there should have been nothing but a wall. The mop slipped from her hands and fell onto the terrazzo floor, its echo traveling the entire 130 feet of the corridor before fading away. Neither of them picked it up. Then he came 2 steps closer and spoke. His voice wasn't the flat, even voice everyone in the building knew. The voice that made people rise from their chairs without understanding why they were standing. It was lower, and it broke slightly on the first word, as though he himself wasn't certain of what he had just heard. Who taught you that? By day, the 30th floor was an entirely different place. The terrazzo floor Delaney cleaned at night reflected the white light from 2 rows of recessed fixtures. The elevators ran constantly, and at the end of the corridor stood the large conference room with a glass wall overlooking the harbor. She had been promoted to office assistant that spring, and one of her duties was to stand in the corner of the conference room holding the coffee pot, refilling cups when needed, and remaining still when she wasn't. That day, 7 people were seated around the table. The man sitting across from Emmett Kane owned a trucking company that had held a contract to transport refrigerated freight for the company for 4 years. His hair was neatly combed, the cuffs of his shirt sharply starched, and he was explaining why a container at Pier 3 was missing part of its cargo. He explained a great deal. He talked about a defective seal from the factory, about a new driver who had quit, about an error in reconciling the paperwork, about how he himself had only learned of the matter that morning. The more he spoke, the more details he added, and the more details he added, the more his hands moved across the tabletop. Emmett Kane didn't interrupt him once. He sat leaning slightly back, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, his eyes fixed straight ahead, and he allowed the other man to speak until he had emptied himself of words. When the final sentence fell away, and no other followed it, the only sound left in the room was the ventilation system. Emmett didn't change his posture. He merely turned his left wrist slightly upward, glanced at the face of his watch, and spoke. He said 4 words. "You have 30 seconds. No one in the room asked what the 30 seconds were for. The man across from him didn't ask either. And that was the most frightening thing of all, because it meant he understood. His face went white very quickly, the kind of pallor that began around the mouth before spreading upward. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He tried again, and this time half a word escaped before he closed his mouth, realizing that anything he said now would only be another version of what he had already said. The person seated to his left withdrew his hand from the table and placed it in his lap. The person on his right looked down at the folder in front of him as though something inside it urgently required his attention. No one drank any water. No one turned a page. 30 seconds in a room with 7 people, with not one of them breathing loudly enough to be heard, was longer than any stretch of time anyone there had ever known. Delaney stood in the corner, holding the coffee pot in both hands, counting the seconds by the beating of her heart. Then Emmett Kane rose. He fastened the top button of his jacket in a single motion, neither hurried nor forceful. He didn't say another word. He didn't look back at the man across from him or at anyone else around the table. He walked to the door and opened it with the same amount of force anyone would use to open a door. Before it had fully closed behind him, a sound rose inside the room that Delaney would remember for a very long time. The sound of a 50-year-old man in a starched shirt beginning to cry in front of 6 other people, while not one of those 6 offered him anything at all. Out in the corridor, 3 groups of people were standing and talking. One group was beside the printer, another near the coffee station, and the third at the turn leading toward the elevators. Emmett walked past them, and all 3 conversations fell silent almost at once. Not because anyone had given a signal, but in the way birds perched on a power line go quiet when a shadow passes over them. He kept walking, no faster than usual. Behind him, those 3 groups remained motionless until the elevator doors closed, and only then did they begin speaking again, every voice lower than it had been before. Inside the conference room, people began to rise. Chairs were pushed back. Documents gathered with excessive care. The man with the neatly combed hair remained in his seat, both hands covering his face, and Delaney walked over, placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him, filled it to the brim, then stepped back to her place. She did it without haste or hesitation, and her hands didn't tremble at all. She was the only person in that room still moving normally. Out in the corridor, just before stepping into the elevator, Emmett Kane had paused for a single beat and looked back over his shoulder. He saw her. After that rainy night, he began coming down, never during the day. By day, he was the man who could silence 3 conversations in a corridor at once, and by day, Delaney still stood in the corner of the conference room, holding the coffee pot, addressed him by his title, and lowered her head when he passed, just as everyone else did. But during the hours when the building had emptied, when the ventilation system dropped into its nighttime setting, and the elevators returned by themselves to the lobby. He came down to whichever floor she was cleaning. He never gave her any warning. He simply appeared, pulled a plastic supply bin from an alcove in the wall, sat on it, and placed his cup of coffee beside his foot. He hardly ever drank that coffee. It cooled during the entire time he sat there, and when he finally stood, it was still nearly full, and Delaney would pour it out after he left without saying anything. Within a few weeks, she had learned the sound of his footsteps on the terrazzo floor. The security guards wore rubber-soled shoes and walked quickly, dragging their heels a little. The maintenance workers wore boots, and their steps were heavy and uneven. His were slow and certain, the distance between them always the same, with a tiny pause where the corridor changed from terrazzo to carpet. She could recognize him from the far end of the 130-foot corridor. They talked while she worked. She never stopped moving, and he never asked her to stop. Some nights, he merely sat in silence, and they let the sound of the mop sliding across the floor fill the space between them. Then, little by little, he began to tell her things. He told her that he had grown up in a fourth-floor apartment on the north side of the city, where the electrical system was so old that whenever the rain came down hard, the entire building went dark. He told her that when it happened, his mother didn't look for candles. She sat on the edge of the bed and whistled. He said that when she whistled, the darkness grew smaller. Those were the exact words he used, and he offered no explanation. And Delaney didn't ask for one because she knew precisely what he meant. His mother died when he was 6. After that came long years in another building, one much larger than the first, and he said that he had never heard anyone whistle inside that building, not even once. He said only 2 sentences about his father. He said his father died one night in the North End when he was 24, and that after that night he learned one thing, that in their world, the person who hesitated lost everything. When he finished, he looked down at his coffee, and he didn't speak of it again for the next 8 years. What neither of them could explain was the melody. He was certain that no one else alive knew it. She was certain it was the tune her mother had whistled in the kitchen beside that stack of half-folded towels. 2 mothers at opposite ends of the city, 2 lives that had never touched at a single point, and the same sequence of notes rising before falling gently at the end of the phrase. One night, he asked what her mother had done for a living, and she answered, and he nodded. And neither of them could think of anything more. They left it there. Some things are put away because there isn't enough information to open them, and neither of them knew that the answer was already lying inside an old personnel file at a hospital on the west side of the city, waiting another 8 years for someone to find it. That fall, Delaney was promoted to personal secretary. The decision was signed by the personnel department, but everyone understood where it had come from. She had a desk just outside his office, a computer, an appointment book, and access to the complete record of everyone entering and leaving the 30th floor. She learned very quickly. She remembered the names of every partner's wife and children, remembered who couldn't drink coffee with milk, remembered which contract came due in which month without ever turning on her computer. And one October morning, during a meeting with 11 people present, he said something perfectly ordinary. "Miss, Marsh knows more about that than I do." Everyone at the table turned to look at her. Delaney stood there, still holding the folder in both hands, and realized that this was the first time in her life anyone had spoken her name in a crowded room without doing it, to order her to perform some task. That winter, a small thing happened at Pier 4 that almost no one on the 30th floor ever heard about. The wife of a longshoreman named Hollis Bray needed emergency surgery, and the insurance company sent a letter refusing coverage on the grounds that her condition had existed before the policy took effect. Delaney learned about it because the pier supervisor submitted a request for assistance, and that request crossed her desk before it reached anyone else's. She read it on a Tuesday morning between 2 telephone calls, and she said nothing to anyone. That afternoon, she went down to the 14th floor, entered the accounting office, and placed a form on the desk requesting that her entire year-end bonus be transferred into an expense category called the Employee Assistance Fund. She made 2 things very clear. First, the money had to be sent directly to the hospital, without passing through the family's hands. Second, her name wasn't to appear on any line of any document. The person sitting across the desk that day was the chief accountant, a woman with salt and pepper hair and thin-framed glasses, and she picked up the paper, read it from top to bottom, then read it again. Rosalind Teague didn't ask why. She merely removed her glasses, placed them on top of a stack of files, and looked at Delaney for a long time, with the gaze of a woman who had kept books for 20 years and had learned to read a person's character in the expenses they chose to conceal. Then she put her glasses back on, signed the form, and said the transaction would be recorded exactly as Delaney wanted. The money was transferred before the holiday. The surgery went well. Hollis Bray returned to work after 10 days of leave, and once, when he encountered Delaney in the lobby on the ground floor, he nodded to her exactly as he would have nodded to any other office employee, then continued out through the entrance. He never knew. In the records, the payment rested neatly beneath a generic name that appeared only once each year in the annual report, and no one had ever read that line closely. In time, Delaney herself forgot about it, the way people forget something that has been done and that no one else needs to know about. That was how the winter passed, until the morning the federal agents arrived. They came early, went straight to the 30th floor, and were very polite. The indictment was served in the office, thicker than Delaney had expected, and she signed the acknowledgement of receipt because that was the personal secretary's responsibility. Then came 3 hours with every attorney present, while Delaney sat at her desk outside the office, the door closed, hearing voices through it without being able to make out a single word. When the door opened, the chief counsel came out first, and he spoke to Emmett right there in the doorway, without lowering his voice, perhaps because he believed there was no longer any point in hiding it. He said there would be no bail, that with charges of this kind, they would never grant bail, and that if the prosecution proceeded the way it usually did, the time from pretrial detention to judgment could be 3 years. When he had finished, he walked toward the elevators. Inside the office, Emmett Kane stood with his back to the door, looking down at the harbor through the glass wall. He remained that way for a very long time. Delaney sat at her desk outside, both hands resting on the keyboard without typing a single word, and she watched his back, and for the first time in 4 years, she realized that there was something he couldn't arrange. 3 years was an easy number to say. It was only 3 words long. No one in the building that day understood how long 3 years truly was, and not one of them could have imagined that it would be enough time for a man in a fully buttoned gray suit to erase a human being from every page in the city. He was required to surrender on Monday morning. On Sunday night, Delaney stayed on the 30th floor later than usual because there was a stack of transfer files she hadn't finished arranging, and she heard those footsteps coming from the far end of the corridor. But this time, there was no cup of coffee in his hand, no supply bin pulled from the alcove in the wall, no melody at all. He stopped in the doorway of the secretary's office, and he stood there for a while before he could speak his first sentence. He said he couldn't give her a wedding. No church, no guests, no one standing to offer a blessing, none of the dress a woman was supposed to wear once in her life. He said he couldn't give her a proper year of courtship either, couldn't take her to dinner anywhere people might see them, couldn't allow her to enter a room beside him in daylight. He said 3 years was long enough for a man to disappear from a woman's life without anyone's help. Then he said there was exactly one thing he could give her. He said he could give her a name, and that name would be written on paper, and no one could erase what was on paper. Delaney rose from her chair. "Do you understand that if anyone finds out, I'll lose everything?" she asked. He answered, "If no one finds out, then you have nothing to lose, and that's something I can't accept." She asked him why her. He was silent for a moment, then said that in 8 years inside that building, she was the only person who had never been afraid of him, and a man like him encountered that only once. They left while it was still dark. Mike Appel drove, 21 years old, and only 6 months into the job, and he didn't ask a single question throughout the drive. He glanced into the rearview mirror only twice. At that hour, Boston City Hall was almost deserted. Only half the corridor lights had been turned on. The floor was still streaked with moisture from the mop, and only one clerk was on duty at the registration counter. Doreen Bexley had already worked the night shift there for 30 years. Her hair was completely white, and she wore 2 pairs of glasses, one perched on her nose, and the other hanging from a cord around her neck. And she received them exactly as she received everyone else. She checked their identification. She read every line of the registration form aloud, slowly, without omitting a single word, including the lines everyone else skipped. She asked each of them the required question, and waited for a complete answer. Then she stamped the form, signed her name in the box for the first witness, and afterward did something no regulation required. She pulled a worn hardcover ledger from beneath the counter, opened it to the half-completed page, and copied by hand every detail from the record she had just processed. The date, the names, the file number, and the names of both witnesses. Mike Appel watched her do it with a slightly puzzled expression, and she looked up and told him that when she first started working there, the computer system had once lost an entire month of records, and ever since then she had written everything down by hand, and anyone who wanted to laugh could laugh. When she finished speaking, she closed the book and returned it beneath the counter. No one in the room gave it another second of thought. Mike Appel signed the box for the second witness, holding his baseball cap in his left hand, his signature as careful as a schoolboy's. The ring was slipped onto Delaney's finger, and it was too large, and they both knew it was too large, and neither of them said anything. The entire procedure took less than half an hour. When they stepped outside, dawn still hadn't fully broken. There was only a pale gray line behind the rooftops, and the city hadn't yet awakened. Emmett walked her to the car. He didn't kiss her there because there was a camera at the entrance, and even that morning, he remembered it. He merely took both her hands in his and held them very tightly, and he said 2 words, "Wait for me." Then he released her, turned away, and Delaney stood on the stone steps of Boston City Hall watching until the car disappeared around the corner. On Monday morning, he surrendered on time, and Delaney Marsh went to work as usual, sat down at the same desk outside the empty office, and began to wait. The first thing Emmett Kane did after the door closed behind him wasn't call a bail bondsman, nor was it ask about the trial. He requested a meeting with his attorney that same day, and during that meeting, he spoke about only one thing. He said there was a name that had to be removed from everything. The attorney explained the situation to him very clearly, and Emmett understood it before the man had even finished. In a federal case of this kind, the prosecution would work from the outside inward, and they would do it by finding the people who had been closest to him, who had sat outside his office for 4 years, who had kept his schedule, who had signed for his correspondence, who knew who had called and at what hour, who still remembered the appointments that had never appeared in the calendar. That person would be summoned. And if that person was married to the defendant, matters would become many times worse, because the prosecution would then have another avenue to pursue, and they would dig through her life to its very bottom, and they would use the marriage itself as leverage. Emmett listened to all of it, then said he wanted no one to find her. It was done legally, and so neatly that no one could challenge it. Delaney Marsh's name was removed from every internal document that connected her directly to him, and she was transferred to the payroll of the General Administration Department. She continued sitting in the same place and performing the same duties, but on paper she was no longer anyone's personal secretary. A petition was filed with the court to seal the marriage record on the grounds that it was necessary to protect a person connected to an ongoing federal criminal case, and the court approved it because it was a legitimate procedure, one used regularly, and no one saw anything unusual in it. From the day the sealing order took effect, anyone who approached the registration counter at Boston City Hall and requested a certified copy of that record, even Delaney Marsh herself, would be told that the record couldn't be provided, not that it didn't exist, only that it couldn't be provided. And to anyone who didn't understand what had happened, those two things sounded exactly the same. Emmett gave one final order. He prohibited every form of direct communication, no visits, because visitor lists were public records, and the prosecution reviewed them every week. No letters sent directly to her, because correspondence from the detention center was read and preserved. His letters would travel through the company's official channels to the office, where someone would place them directly into her hands. He calculated every step, and every step was correct, within the limits of its own calculation. He believed he was building a wall around her, high and sealed, so that for 3 years not a single ray of light would reach where she stood, and no one would know she was there. He built precisely that wall. The only problem was that a wall was sealed in both directions, and the person inside it couldn't see out. Everything else depended on who carried out his instructions. Within a corporation, matters such as removing a name from records, drafting a petition to seal them, dealing with the court, and retaining original documents, all belonged to a single department, and that department was headed by the General Counsel. Arthur Devlin received his instructions that afternoon. He didn't ask a single question, showed no surprise, and completed every procedure faster than anyone could have expected. He read every line of the marriage certificate before placing it in the petition file for sealing. He knew the name written there, knew the date, and even knew the names of both witnesses. He knew about the marriage from the very first day, before anyone else in the building had time to suspect a thing. And when everything had been completed, he performed one small act that hadn't appeared in any instruction. He kept the only surviving certified copy, placed it inside an envelope, and locked it in the safe in his office on the 28th floor. From that day forward, on every page of every record in the city, Delaney Marsh had never married anyone. The only evidence proving otherwise lay exactly 2 floors away from the desk where she worked, inside a safe she didn't know existed, belonging to the man who would one day stand on shore and ask 40 people whether she had ever told them she was married. The list of people permitted to visit Emmett Kane was very short, and it contained exactly one name that didn't belong to an attorney. Sully Doran visited once a month, always on the same day of the week, always wearing the same kind of coat, and always taking his seat before Emmett was brought out. The visitation room at the Federal Detention Center was a row of narrow booths divided by thick glass, each one furnished with a plastic chair bolted to the floor and a telephone receiver hanging on the wall. The glass wasn't entirely clear. It was slightly clouded in the center from tens of thousands of faces pressed against it, so every face seen through it appeared a little blurred, even the face of the person one knew best. Emmett was brought out, sat down, and lifted the receiver. He didn't ask after anyone. He didn't ask whether it was cold outside, didn't ask how the company was doing, didn't mention the trial, and didn't complain about the place where he was sitting. Some people begin to talk more when they lose their freedom, as though enough words might make the walls grow thinner. He did the opposite. At every visit, he asked exactly 3 questions, no more. He asked who had come through the gate at Pier 4 during the past week. Sully answered. He asked who had signed the refrigerated freight contract in his place that month. Sully answered. He asked whether anyone outside had been asking about him, and he asked it in the ordinary voice one might use to ask about the weather. Sully took longer to answer that question than the first 2. Then Emmett sat in silence for several seconds, looking through the clouded glass, and spoke one sentence. It was brief, with no one's name in it, and no verb that the person listening at the other end of the line could enter into a report. Sully Doran nodded once, set down the receiver, and left. Not long afterward, a trucking company that had been quietly trying to encroach upon Cane Harbor's refrigerated freight route suddenly withdrew voluntarily from a contract that was still in force, accepted every penalty, and sold its fleet to a third party for a price that anyone capable of reading a balance sheet could recognize as a loss. There was no dispute, no lawsuit, not a single line in the newspapers. People saw only that the paperwork had been filed, and everything had been neatly concluded before the end of the quarter. On the 30th floor of Cane Harbor, the news was mentioned during a morning briefing that lasted less than a minute before the meeting moved to the next item. But at Pier 4, where the longshoremen stood smoking between shifts, the story was repeated far more often. They spoke about it in low voices, and everyone understood that it shouldn't be said aloud. Some said he was still here, some said he would be out in 3 years, and it would be best if no one did anything that might force them to remember the day he returned. And what made all those stories colder than any threat, what no one standing at Pier 4 ever said aloud but everyone thought about, was that the man hadn't once left the plastic chair bolted to the floor inside that booth with its clouded glass. He didn't need to leave it. He needed only 3 questions each month, one answer of his own, and a man sitting on the other side of the glass who knew exactly what to do with it. During those 3 years, Emmett Kane never lost control of the Boston waterfront. He lost exactly one thing, and it was the only thing he couldn't arrange from inside. He didn't know what was happening to his letters. The letters arrived regularly, one each month, sent through the company's official channels exactly as instructed, and the office of the general counsel on the 28th floor signed for them. Arthur Devlin handled them in the evenings, after everyone else on the floor had gone home. He followed the same routine every time. He turned on his desk lamp, switched off the overhead lights, slit the envelope open with a wooden-handled letter opener, and read. He read carefully, read every word, skipped no line. Not even the ones another person might have felt embarrassed to see because they were too intimate. He read them as though they were contracts, lightly tracing a fingernail beneath the passages worth noting, and he remembered them for a very long time. Those letters contained everything. There was news that the trial had been postponed for another quarter. There were the names of the people on the other side who were trying to draw it out. There were long passages about 3 years and how they ought to be counted. One letter said plainly, in Emmett's own handwriting, that he had married her, and that when he came home, they wouldn't have to hide it from anyone anymore. Another was only half a page long, the handwriting slanting more than usual, saying that the night before, he had lain awake listening to the ventilation system and realized that it moved in the same rhythm as the one on the 30th floor. When Devlin finished reading, he rose, carried the letter to the scanner in the corner of the office, placed it face down on the glass, scanned it into a file, named the file after the month, and saved it in a folder on his private hard drive. He did this with the calm of a man preserving payment records. To him, no piece of paper was worthless. Everything was an asset, and assets had to be kept because no one could predict the day when something might be needed to bargain with someone. When the scan was complete, he carried the original letter to the shredder beside the door and fed it into the machine. It ran for about 3 seconds, then fell silent. He turned off the desk lamp and went home. 36 times he followed that same routine, once each month, never departing from the procedure. But if that had been all Arthur Devlin did, he wouldn't have kept an entire harbor in his hands for 3 years. What he did during the day was the important part. Cane Harbor's wages were paid on time, without a single exception, even during the months when containers were held up in customs and the money hadn't yet come in. When a longshoreman at Pier 2 fractured his pelvis in a fall, the company paid every dollar of his hospital bills, and no one had to submit a request. When 2 operations crews argued over the division of weekend shifts, Devlin listened to both sides for 40 minutes, then devised an arrangement that left each side believing it had received the better share. He remembered the names of the crew supervisors' wives and children. He attended the funeral of a forklift driver's father and stood in the back row, making no speech, simply standing there. People began calling him the only man still keeping the place decent while the boss was away. And during those 3 years, gratitude quietly accomplished what threats never could. Grateful people didn't ask questions. Grateful people noticed when something wasn't right, but invented an explanation that sounded reasonable. Grateful people, when their names were called during a roll call, gave the answer the man who had paid their wife's hospital bills wanted to hear. No one at Cane Harbor ever asked why the harbor's operating expenses rose steadily with every quarter when no new construction was underway. No one asked who had signed the orders transferring $40 million into an overseas account, divided into dozens of smaller transactions, each one kept below the reporting threshold. In that entire building of 30 floors, exactly 2 people possessed both the authority and the patience to see that number, and one of them sat in the accounting office on the 14th floor. As for his daughter, Devlin handled that with a single sentence, repeated often enough at enough fundraising dinners that it became something everyone believed had been settled long ago. He needed only to say that when Mr. Kane returned, the 2 families would have happy news. Delaney had a habit the entire building knew about, and no one ever questioned. Every morning, before going up to the 30th floor, she stopped at the reception desk in the lobby and opened the incoming mail log. She turned the pages slowly, running her finger down the column of recipients' names, 1 page every morning, as regularly as someone taking medicine. She searched for her own name. She did it through the first winter, then spring, then summer, then the second winter. She did it on mornings when she had slept, and on mornings when she hadn't. She never found her name. But because she searched that log every day for 3 years, she knew it better than anyone else in the building, including the receptionist. And because she knew it so well, she noticed something very small. Every month, the same kind of entry appeared. A priority courier package from Illinois, signed for by the office of the General Counsel on the 28th floor. There was nothing unusual about that in itself, because the 28th floor received all kinds of documents from all over the country. The strange part lay elsewhere. Under company procedure, every priority package had to be entered into the mail system within 24 hours, assigned a tracking number, and marked with the name of the person to whom it had been forwarded. Delaney had access to that system because she still had to look up contracts every week. She searched for one package. It wasn't there. She searched for the package from the previous month. That one wasn't there either. She went back through 6 months of records, and not one of those packages existed in the system. They were signed for in the lobby and then disappeared. She told no one. She took out the old desk calendar from the previous year, the one she had intended to throw away, and began copying the information. The back of every calendar page was blank, and she wrote on it in pencil, her handwriting small, date received, tracking number, initials of the person who signed for it on the 28th floor. She did this during her lunch break at her desk, with the calendar turned face down beneath a folder. After 4 months, she had a list. Then she did something only a personal secretary who had occupied that position for 4 years would have thought to do. She remembered that every harbor operating expense required the General Counsel's approval signature, that every approval signature carried a date, and that all those dates were stored in a system she was authorized to view because she still had to prepare the quarterly reports. She pulled up the list of expense authorization orders, printed it on the 18th floor, where few people passed, then brought it back and placed it beside the calendar. She compared them one October evening after everyone else on the floor had gone home. Using a ruler, she drew 2 columns, one for the date each package from Illinois had been signed for, and one for the date each expense authorization had been signed. Then she began checking from the top. The first line matched. She thought it was a coincidence. The second line matched. The third line matched. She put down her pencil, rose, went to get a glass of water, drank it all, then returned to her chair and began checking again from the beginning. The 4th line, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th. She checked all 23 entries. The dates weren't merely close. They weren't simply within the same week. They matched exactly, down to the day. Every time a package from Illinois was signed for in the lobby and disappeared from the system, an authorization for harbor operating expenses was signed on the 28th floor that very same day. Delaney sat for a long time before those two columns of figures. Beyond the glass, the harbor was pitch black, just as it had been every other night during the 8 years she had worked in that building. She didn't know what those packages contained. It had never occurred to her that they might have anything to do with her. She knew only one thing for certain, that the two columns of numbers lying side by side on the page before her couldn't possibly be a coincidence, and that she couldn't ask anyone on the 30th floor about them. The next morning, she folded the sheet of paper into quarters, slipped it into her coat pocket, and pressed the elevator button for the 14th floor. At that hour, only one corner of the accounting office on the 14th floor was still lit. Rosalind Teague remained at the desk farthest inside, beneath the old brass-based lamp she had brought from home a very long time ago, and as on most evenings, she was the last person left on the floor. Delaney knocked on the door. Roz looked up, saw her, and didn't ask what was wrong. She merely tilted her chin toward the chair across from her. Delaney sat down, took the sheet of paper folded into quarters from her coat pocket, smoothed it flat, and pushed it across the desk. Then she said that she didn't understand what she was looking at, and didn't know whom to ask. Roz drew the paper closer, pushed her glasses higher on the bridge of her nose, and read. She read very slowly. She didn't say a word. Delaney sat in silence, listening to the clock on the wall and the air conditioning on the 14th floor, and counted more than 90 beats before Roz moved again. She didn't turn the paper over. She didn't ask where Delaney had found the information. She merely raised one hand, removed her glasses, folded the arms, and set them beside the paper. Then she sat motionless, both hands resting on the desk, her eyes fixed on the empty space beyond Delaney's shoulder. She remained that way for so long that Delaney began to feel afraid. When she finally spoke, her voice was rougher than usual. She asked Delaney whether she knew what she had just handed her. Delaney said she didn't. Roz nodded, almost to herself, then said that was for the best. She rose, walked to the door, closed it, and checked the handle twice before returning to her chair. Then she began to speak, using the same steady voice in which she read balance sheets during quarterly meetings, perhaps because it was the only way she could keep herself calm. She told Delaney that the number she needed to examine wasn't on this sheet of paper, but in the place to which the paper pointed. She said that for the past 3 years, money had been leaving the company in small installments, each one below the reporting threshold, each one classified as a harbor operating expense, because that was the largest category and the easiest one in which to hide it. She said she had begun to suspect something the previous year, but had no way to prove it, because every individual payment was legitimate, and she hadn't possessed what Delaney had just brought her, the dates that would tell her exactly which days to examine. Then she gave Delaney the number. She said that as of the previous quarter, the total was approximately $40 million. Delaney heard the figure and showed no reaction for several seconds, because it was so large that it no longer seemed like money. Then she asked Roz a question, the question that had brought her down to the 14th floor that evening. She asked what the packages from Illinois were. Roz looked at her for a long time before answering, and in the light from the desk lamp, Delaney saw the woman's face change, saw her weigh the choice, saw her make her decision. Then Roz said that Illinois was where Mr. Kane was being detained. She said one package arrived from there every month, was signed for in the lobby, sent directly to the 28th floor, and never entered into the system. She said she didn't know what was written inside those packages, and didn't want to know. She knew only one thing, and it was so obvious that a person didn't need to be a chief accountant to see it. Every time one of those packages arrived, someone signed an expense authorization that very same day. Not the following day, not the following week, that exact day. She said people did that only when they had just finished reading something and knew with certainty that it would never reach anyone else. It was the only day of the month when they could be absolutely certain that no one was watching. Delaney sat perfectly still. She had come down to the 14th floor with a question about 2 columns of numbers, and she realized that she had just received the answer to another question, the one she had carried for 3 years each morning as she opened the log at the reception desk. She opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Roz Teague reached across the desk and took Delaney's hand. Her hand was cold, the knuckles slightly swollen, but she held on very tightly. She told Delaney to listen carefully. From that moment forward, she mustn't call Roz using any telephone inside the building, mustn't come down to the 14th floor looking for her again, and mustn't mention this to anyone, not even the person she believed she trusted most. She told her to continue going to work as usual, to keep opening the log at the reception desk every morning as she had for the past 8 years, and not to change a single habit. Then she released Delaney's hand, folded the paper into quarters along the old creases, and pushed it back across the desk toward her. After Delaney left, Rosalind Teague didn't turn off the desk lamp. She remained in that same place for a while longer, both hands resting on the desk. Then she rose and began to work. She worked throughout the night. She pulled every harbor operating expense record from the past 3 years, one file at a time, and arranged them in a row along the edge of the desk. She retrieved the account statements, the bank reconciliations, and the journal vouchers that only the chief accountant was authorized to print. She did what she had done for 20 years and did better than anyone else in the building, arranging scattered numbers into a line so they could reveal what they were hiding. She didn't hurry. She numbered every page in pencil at the upper right corner, wrote notes in the margins using the private shorthand of people who kept books, and when she had finished, she checked everything again from the beginning, because she was a woman who never submitted a set of figures without reviewing it twice. Near dawn, she carried everything to the copier at the far end of the room, an old machine that ran slowly and made a great deal of noise, and she stood there waiting for each page to emerge. She duplicated everything. She placed the originals inside a large brown envelope. She placed the copies inside a second envelope. Then she sat down, tore a scrap from the pad of notepaper on her desk, and wrote 6 words on it: "Give it to whoever dares look." She didn't sign her name. She slipped the note into the second envelope, sealed it, and carried it down to the basement. In the underground garage, the morning shift was just beginning, and Mike Appel was cleaning the windows of the company car as he always did before each shift. In all 30 floors of that building, the 24-year-old driver was the person no one ever noticed. He had no desk, no access code to the system, appeared in no meetings, and his name existed only on a shift schedule posted inside the security office. Roz Teague walked over to him, handed him the envelope, and said she needed him to keep it for her. He asked whom he was supposed to give it to. She told him that, for now, he wasn't to give it to anyone. He was simply to put it somewhere outside the building and tell no one that she had given it to him. Mike Appel looked at her, then at the envelope. He was the man who had once stood at a registration counter inside Boston City Hall, before the city was awake, his cap held in one hand, and signed his name in the box for the second witness. He had kept that secret for 3 years, and hadn't told a soul. He nodded, opened the trunk, placed the envelope beneath the spare tire cover, then closed it again. She thanked him and went upstairs. That morning, Rosalind Teague didn't go directly to the 14th floor. She walked out to Broadway, entered the branch of the bank where she had opened an account before she ever began working at Cane Harbor, and rented a safe deposit box. She signed the required papers, placed the brown envelope inside the box, locked it, and carried the small key out of the vault. The bank employee asked whether she wanted to name an additional person with access. She considered it for a moment, then said no. She slipped the key into an inner compartment of her purse, walked back to the building, and sat down at her desk on time, just as she did every day. 2 nights later, the night shift at the loading pier. During those same days, 900 miles away, Emmett Kane lay on the bunk in his cell and thought about something that had kept him awake for weeks. He had the receipt for every letter. The company's official channel operated exactly as it was supposed to. Every package sent had a tracking number, and every tracking number came back marked successfully delivered, with a signature, a date, and a time. 36 packages sent, 36 signed for. Not one lost, not one returned, and for 3 years, not a single line in reply. He had spent many nights explaining it to himself in the most comforting way possible. He told himself she was angry. He told himself that he had left her alone inside a building full of people where no one was allowed to know who she was, and that a woman had every right to be angry over far less than that. But the longer he considered that explanation, the less it held together, because it didn't fit the thing he knew best. A woman who had been hurt would write. She would write one letter, even if it was only one, and inside it there would be a question he couldn't answer, or an accusation so heavy that he would have to read it 3 times. Or she would write and tear it up, then write again, and in the end she would still send it. People didn't remain silent for 36 consecutive months. People didn't remain silent with such perfect regularity. What he was receiving wasn't silence. What he was receiving was absolute emptiness, without a single ripple, without one break in rhythm, and an emptiness that orderly couldn't have been created by a human heart. It was the product of a process. He sat up in the darkness and thought of the next question. The question he should have asked 3 years earlier. Who was handling the letters? At the next visit, he didn't ask his usual 3 questions. He asked only one. and it contained no one's name, only a title and a floor number. Sully Doran nodded once and left. 3 weeks later, Sully returned and spoke 3 brief facts into the receiver. Emmett listened to all of them, set the receiver down, and sat staring through the clouded glass longer than he had during any previous visit. It was at that very time that the verdict was returned. He was acquitted. They returned his wristwatch and an envelope containing his personal effects, and he signed the property receipt. Before leaving, he did one final thing. He wrote the 37th letter and sent it by the fastest available service, 3 days ahead of his own arrival. That letter was shorter than all the others. In it, he wrote that he had been acquitted and was on his way home, that he would arrive in 3 days, that Delaney Marsh was his lawful wife, and that this had been recorded on paper before he left, and that if anyone laid a hand on her during those 3 days, that person would answer directly to him. The package arrived one afternoon and was signed for in the lobby, just as the previous 36 had been. That evening, Arthur Devlin turned on his desk lamp, switched off the overhead lights, slid open the envelope with the wooden-handled knife, and read. When he finished, he read it a second time, more slowly. Then he rose. But this time, he didn't walk toward the scanner, nor did he walk toward the shredder beside the door. He folded the letter along its original creases, returned it to the envelope, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, because a man who had spent his entire life arranging things understood something that panicked men never did. If everything went smoothly during the next 3 days, this piece of paper would cost him nothing. But if it didn't, if the time came when he had to sit at a table and bargain, then this was the only thing in the world proving that he had been warned in writing, and a man who had been warned always had more to trade than a man who knew nothing. He turned off the desk lamp. He had 3 days. Delaney kept the paper in the bottom drawer of her desk, the drawer with its own lock that every secretary on the 30th floor was given for storing contracts that hadn't yet been made public. She carried the key in her purse and never let it leave her possession. What she hadn't considered, because it belonged to the category of things people never think to consider, was that every lock in the building had a spare key, that all the spare keys for all 30 floors were kept inside a small steel cabinet in the administration office, and that for the past 22 years, the key to that cabinet had been held by Bernadette Fallon. No one had ever questioned it. She was the woman who approved vacation requests, remembered everyone's birthday on the floor, made tea for anyone who caught a cold, and carried it directly to their desk. She was also a woman with a debt. It had happened several years earlier, and it involved her son, and it had begun with small numbers in a place in the city where decent people had no business going. By the time she learned about it, the number was no longer small, and the people who had lent the money weren't the sort who sent payment reminders. Bernadette Fallon had sat in her kitchen throughout an entire night, and the following morning she went up to the 28th floor. Arthur Devlin listened to everything she had to say. He didn't ask for any further details, showed no surprise, and offered not one word of judgment. He merely asked the name of the place, wrote it on a scrap of paper, then told her to return to work as usual. Within a week, the debt disappeared. No one called her house again. No one stood at the end of her street again. And most important of all, afterward he never mentioned it. Not once, for years. He didn't ask to be repaid. He didn't hint at it. He never looked at her in a way that carried a hint. He simply allowed it to remain there, silent between them, like a box sitting in the corner of a room that both people knew was there. And the less they spoke of it, the heavier it became. So when he summoned her late one afternoon and said he was concerned about Miss Marsh, that he had heard she had recently been keeping certain documents in her drawer that fell outside her authority, that he only wanted to look at them to make sure she wasn't placing herself in danger, Bernadette Fallon didn't ask a single question. She merely stood there holding a stack of files against her stomach, as she always did, and listened to everything he said. She took the paper at the end of the day, after the 30th floor had emptied. She opened the drawer, lifted the sheet, folded into quarters, and stood beside the desk holding it for a while in the darkness. Then she locked the drawer again exactly as it had been. On the 28th floor, Devlin was still in his office. She entered without knocking because the door was open, walked to the front of his desk, and placed the paper on the glass surface. She didn't say a word. She didn't look at him either. She looked only at the paper she had placed on that desk for exactly 1 second, then turned and left, still holding the stack of files against her stomach. Devlin didn't thank her. He understood that gratitude in such a moment would have been an unnecessary cruelty. He waited until the sound of her footsteps had traveled the length of the corridor, then drew the paper toward him and switched on his desk lamp. The following morning, the elevator doors opened onto the 30th floor shortly before 9 o'clock. Camille Devlin stepped out first and walked straight ahead without stopping at the reception desk. her high heels striking the 130 feet of terrazzo flooring that stretched from the elevators to the glass wall at the far end of the corridor. It was the same floor across which, 8 years earlier, during the hours when the building stood empty, a 19-year-old girl had pushed a chemical cart on squeaking plastic wheels 3 times every night, mopping as she whistled to make the room feel less empty. Elias Stroud and 4 of his men followed behind her. Halfway down the corridor, Delaney rose from her desk. Every keyboard on the floor fell silent. Not one person stood, and at the far end of the corridor, beside the copier, Bernadette Fallon stood holding a stack of files against her stomach, staring down at the floor before the toes of her shoes. What Arthur Devlin hadn't calculated, what neither Bernadette Fallon nor Camille knew, had happened the night before. Delaney knew. She had known since the afternoon she stood at the reception desk in the lobby and heard the young receptionist casually mention that the administration office had just borrowed the cabinet containing the spare keys. She became more certain when Bernadette Fallon passed her desk at the end of the day, without asking whether she would be staying late. Something Bernadette hadn't forgotten once in 8 years. And she knew completely when she opened the bottom drawer the following morning and found the paper still lying exactly where she had left it, but with its creases opened and folded again in a different direction. She closed the drawer, locked it, and worked through the rest of the day exactly as she always did. She answered the telephone, drafted 2 memoranda, and carried coffee into the conference room at 11 o'clock. Not one person on the 30th floor saw anything unusual in her. That night, she returned to her rented apartment on the south side of the city, and she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table beneath the only light still burning in the apartment, and she thought very carefully about what she could do. She considered running away and rejected it because a person who ran turned herself into a confession. She considered finding an attorney, and rejected that because every attorney whose name she knew worked for the company. She considered walking directly into a police station, and rejected that because she had no way to prove who she was. No way to explain why a secretary possessed those numbers, and she understood perfectly well that in this city, they would call the company to verify her story before they did anything else. Then she thought of the only option left. Near dawn, she walked to the grocery store on the corner that stayed open all night, where an old copier stood beside the register, and made a duplicate of her paper. She paid with coins. She bought a large envelope and a strip of stamps. She returned home, placed the copy inside the envelope, and sat for a long time before writing the address because she had exactly one chance to send it to the right place. She addressed it to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts. She attached the stamps, using more postage than necessary because she was afraid it wouldn't be enough. She didn't write a return address, because her name might cause the envelope to be intercepted somewhere along the way. Then she put on her coat and walked 3 blocks to the blue postal box on the corner, the box she had passed thousands of times over 8 years without ever using. Dawn hadn't yet broken. She pulled down the metal door, placed the envelope inside, and kept her hand there for one more beat before releasing it. The door closed with a dry, metallic sound. A small sign fastened to the side of the box listed the collection time and class of mail. First-class mail, 3 business days. She stood beneath the streetlight reading those words, and she performed a very simple calculation in her head, one that from that moment forward would determine everything. Then she walked home, showered, changed her clothes, and arrived at the company on time. That was the real reason. On the abandoned ferry landing that afternoon, when Arthur Devlin gave her 2 choices, and all 40 people on shore believed they were watching a stubborn woman choose death for the sake of a man, not one of them understood what was truly happening. Delaney Marsh wasn't standing there waiting for someone to rescue her. She wasn't hoping for a car to appear on the access road. She was there because she was buying time. Every hour she remained standing in the water was another hour in which that envelope traveled farther through the postal system, through a sorting center, onto a truck, closer to a desk where someone was sitting. And she understood perfectly well what would happen if she signed. If she put her pen to that notarized affidavit and admitted that she had fabricated everything, then when the envelope arrived, it would be opened by someone who had never heard her name, and that person would search the records and find a notarized statement in which the sender herself admitted that she had invented the entire story. The envelope would lose all value within 5 minutes. 3 years of waiting, 1 night spent at the kitchen table, and a woman with salt and pepper hair who had warned her never to call from inside that building again, all of it would wash down the drain with that envelope. The water rose to her waist and continued climbing. She stood still. She was trading her life for 3 business days of postal delivery, and she knew exactly what she was doing. He walked into the lobby of the Kane Harbor building, with his coat still creased from 900 miles on the road, and the young woman at the reception desk sprang to her feet so quickly that she knocked over the cup of pens beside her. He didn't stop. The elevator carried him to the 30th floor, and when the doors opened, the entire floor rose at once, without anyone telling them to, a reflex that even 3 years of absence hadn't managed to erase. He walked down the corridor, and he saw it from halfway there. The desk outside his office was completely bare. No computer, no monitor, only 2 cable holes in the wooden surface and a pale rectangular mark where the desktop hadn't gathered dust. No appointment book. No blue-glazed ceramic mug she always kept on her right. He stopped in front of that desk and stood still. Arthur Devlin appeared at the far end of the corridor less than 2 minutes later. His gray suit buttoned all the way, a thin file in one hand, and he approached at exactly the pace of a man bringing bad news he wished he didn't have to deliver. He greeted him, congratulated him on the ruling, asked whether the drive had been tiring. Then he placed the file on that empty desk, opened it, and stepped back half a pace, as though making room for him to read. Inside was a resignation letter, neatly typed, prepared on the proper human resources form, dated 2 days earlier, and signed at the bottom by Delaney Marsh. Clipped behind it was a receipt for severance payment, stamped and marked with a case number. Devlin didn't hurry him. He let him read every page, and then he spoke, quietly and sincerely, in the voice of an older man trying to say something kindly when there was no kind way to say it. He said she had stayed longer than he had expected. He said 3 years was a long time for a young woman, Mr. Kane. Emmett didn't answer. He looked down at the signature, and for a stretch of time he would later be unable to forgive himself for. He almost believed it, not because of the paper. He had seen thousands of pieces of paper in his life, and he knew paper could be made to say anything. He almost believed it because 3 years of silence had done its work. 36 letters sent, 36 signatures confirming receipt, and not one line sent back. That emptiness had lived inside his chest for 3 years, and every month a little more had been poured into it, and now someone had placed an explanation in front of him that fit it perfectly. He stood there and let that thought pass through him. Then he reached out and pulled open the top drawer of the desk. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe it was only something to do so he wouldn't have to keep standing still. The drawer slid open, nearly empty, with only a few loose paper clips, a box of staples, and a ballpoint pen that had run dry. And in the farthest corner, lying face down, was her employee badge. He picked it up. The photograph was old, taken when she had first been transferred upstairs to work as his personal secretary, her hair tied low, her eyes looking straight into the camera. The plastic edge was worn at the lower corner from 4 years of being swiped through the door twice every day. He held it in his hand and looked at it, and he knew. He knew in the way a person knows something without needing proof. Nobody quit and left their badge behind. A person might forget a mug, forget an appointment book, even forget a coat hanging behind the door. But human resources required every employee badge to be returned and signed off on the departure record, and no one in this building left with their badge still sitting in their own desk drawer. He looked up. Arthur Devlin was still standing there, both hands clasped in front of his stomach, not a single change in his expression. Emmett Kane slipped the badge into his coat pocket, closed the drawer, and walked back toward the elevator without saying another word to him. He went down to the underground parking garage, and there, beside concrete column number 4, beneath the washed-out glare of white fluorescent lights, someone was waiting for him. Mike Appel held a worn envelope in both hands, its edges frayed from having been hidden too long beneath the spare tire lining, and he said someone had asked him to give it to whoever still had the courage to look. Emmett tore the envelope open right there. He read the first page, then the second, and when he reached the third, his hand stopped, because in his mind he suddenly saw 3 beams of white headlights shining straight down onto black water at a ferry landing that was supposed to have been abandoned long ago, the very thing he had seen 6 hours earlier and driven straight past. Out by the mooring post on the deep channel side, the water had risen past her waist long ago, and now it was up to her chest. Delaney couldn't feel her legs anymore. The cold had moved beyond the stage of stinging pain, beyond the stage of heaviness, and into the final stage, the quietest and most dangerous one, when the body begins to stop asking for anything at all. On the dock, Arthur Devlin raised his voice one last time. He said this was the last time he was going to ask. He said all it would take was one signature, and everything would be over within 5 minutes. His voice was still flat, but something new had entered it, something even he didn't recognize, a faint urgency that a man only reveals when he knows he has gone farther than he ever meant to go. Camille Devlin stood about 3 steps behind her father. She had been inching backward little by little for the past half hour without realizing it, and now she stood at the edge of the headlights, her arms wrapped around her own elbows, staring out at the black water with the expression of someone who had just realized that she had given an order, that the order was truly being carried out, and that there was no button anywhere to shut it off. Delaney could hear Devlin's voice, but she could no longer make out the words. She thought of her mother in the kitchen, with the stack of towels still only half folded. She thought of the dark hallway on the 30th floor. She wanted to sing. She opened her mouth and tried, and what came out of her throat was a broken, rasping sound that died after the first half note, because 4 hours in the cold and the salt water had taken that voice from her. She tried again. The same thing happened, so she did the only thing she had left. She pursed her lips, and she whistled. The whistle was thin and trembling, much softer than it had been on those nights on the 30th floor, breaking wherever she had to stop for breath. But the surface of the channel was flat then, and water carried sound much farther than air ever could. The melody slipped across the water, rising and then falling gently at the end of the phrase, at exactly the place where her mother had always lowered her voice before finishing. On the dock, 40 people lifted their heads at once, and the first man to step out of line was Hollis Bray. He didn't say anything. He took off his wool coat, worn shiny at the elbows, threw it onto the concrete, walked 3 steps to the edge of the dock, and waded in. Someone in the line called his name. He didn't turn around. He had no cutters, no key, nothing at all in his hands. And he understood that perfectly well, because he had worked at this dock for 15 years, and he knew there wasn't a human hand alive that could break that steel restraint. So he waded straight out to the mooring post, moved behind her, lowered himself, slipped both shoulders beneath her arms, and stood upright. He lifted her out of the water with his own body. The water dropped away from her chest, then down to her waist, and Delaney drew in her first breath without the cold pressing against her ribs. Elias Stroud shouted from the shore. No one obeyed him. The second person stepped into the water, a forklift driver, then the third, a woman from the inspection crew. The fourth was Bernadette Fallon. She set the stack of files she had been holding against her stomach onto the wet concrete, took off her shoes, and waded in on the bare feet of a 63-year-old woman, without looking at anyone. Then came the fifth person, the sixth, the 10th. The line along the edge of the dock broke apart, and in the middle of it came the sound of tires on the access road, the hard squeal of brakes, then several car doors opening at once. What happened after that happened very quickly, and later no 2 people told it exactly the same way. People remembered the sound of feet running across wet concrete. They remembered a bank of headlights being knocked over, pitching toward the ground, sweeping a band of white light across everyone's legs before going dark. They remembered someone shouting for everyone to stop. They remembered Elias Stroud being forced down onto the ground and held there by 2 of Sully Doran's men. They remembered the clean snap of a high heel breaking on the planks, and Camille Devlin collapsing beside it without making a sound. Arthur Devlin didn't run at all. He remained exactly where he was, his arms hanging at his sides, every button of his suit jacket still fastened. Emmett Kane waded into the water carrying a pair of bolt cutters from the trunk of his car. He didn't say a word to Hollis Bray, because there was no need. He slipped the jaws of the cutters around the chain link and squeezed once, then a second time. The restraint came free. Delaney fell forward, and he caught her, while Hollis Bray straightened behind her, gasping for breath, both hands shaking violently from holding the same position for so long in the freezing water. Emmett lifted her into his arms. He carried her back toward shore, 1 step at a time, and 40 people moved apart on both sides to make a path for him. He laid her down on the wool coat someone had spread across the concrete, then took off his own coat and covered her with it. Then he stood, turned toward every face gathered there, and spoke. He said 1 sentence. "This is my wife." Sully Doran stepped up beside him and held something out, discreetly, low at waist level, in the way one man offers an object when both of them understand exactly what it is meant for. The entire dock went silent. 40 people stood there with their clothes soaked through, many of them still trembling, and not one dared to breathe too loudly. Arthur Devlin stood about 10 steps away, his arms hanging at his sides, completely motionless, and even his calmness was a kind of acknowledgement that he knew what was supposed to happen next in the world he had inhabited for 30 years. Emmett Kane looked down at Sully's hand. Then he raised his eyes and looked at the people standing before him. He saw Hollis Bray being supported by 2 other men, his shoulders still shaking from having held the same position for too long in the freezing water. He saw a 63-year-old woman standing barefoot on wet concrete, her shoes left somewhere behind her. He saw the faces of people whose wages he had paid for 8 years, faces that had stood in a line all afternoon and lowered their eyes, and he understood something he had never dared to consider until that moment. They hadn't been silent because they were cowards. They had been silent because silence was the only sensible thing this world had ever taught them. And he was the one who had built that world. He had spent 6 years turning a harbor gang into something with a chief accountant and tax attorneys. And during those 6 years, he had never once asked himself what lesson he was teaching the wage earners below him. Now he knew. He had taught them that the person who asked questions lost a job, that the person who looked directly at the truth lost even more, and that silence was how you survived. If he took what Sully was offering him, he would only teach that same lesson again, louder and clearer, and all 40 of these people would carry it home with them. He shook his head. He told Sully to put it away. Then he said one more thing. The sentence that 18 months later would bring down everything bearing the Cane Harbor name and allow it to be reborn as something entirely different. He told them to call the federal authorities. Rosalind Teague's file was removed from a safe deposit box at a bank on Broadway under court order, together with what Micah Pell had kept hidden for so many days beneath the spare tire lining, and together with the stamped envelope that had spent 3 full business days moving through the postal system before reaching the desk of a prosecutor who had never heard the name Delaney Marsh. It became something no lawyer could untangle. Emmett turned over everything, including the parts that cost him everything he had, including the parts anyone in his position would have kept back. They found the letter in the inside pocket of Arthur Devlin's suit jacket, the envelope still intact, the folds still undisturbed, the document he had kept as a bargaining chip and which, in the end, became the proof that he had been warned in writing beforehand. Camille Devlin lost everything she had ever believed belonged to her, and they allowed her to leave the city unharmed. At the hospital, Delaney spent 3 days being treated for stage 2 hypothermia, and Emmett didn't leave that room once. Bernadette Fallon sat outside in the hallway on a plastic chair, her face buried in both hands, crying the way a 63-year-old woman cries, without making a sound. On the second day, an elderly woman made 3 separate bus connections to get there, her hair completely white, wearing 2 pairs of glasses, one on her nose and another hanging from a cord around her neck, carrying a worn hardcover notebook wrapped in a plastic bag against the rain. Doreen Bexley set it down at the nurse's station and said exactly one sentence. I wrote it down. I wrote down everything. That notebook, something no one had bothered to pay attention to for 30 years, was what brought the sealed marriage back into the light within a single afternoon. On the 3rd day, Sully Doran brought in a thick stack of papers and placed it on the edge of the bed. 36 letters, scanned from the originals, 1 for every month, without a single month missing, recovered from the hard drive of the very man who had destroyed them, because a man who regarded everything as property never truly threw anything away. Delaney read the first letter. Halfway through the second, she couldn't continue. Emmett took the stack from her hands, sat down on the edge of the bed, and read every letter aloud to her, in the same voice that had once whistled through the dark hallway on the 30th floor, and he kept reading throughout that afternoon until the sky outside had gone completely dark. And the answer to the question they had both carried quietly for 8 years was hidden in an old personnel file at a hospital on the west side of the city, found when the attorneys went back through Delaney's entire history to restore her records. There, on the roster for the night shift in the palliative care ward, was the name Maeve Marsh, and on the patient list for that same ward, during those same final weeks, was the name Nuala Kane. A night shift nursing aide had sat beside the bed of a woman who was preparing to leave this world, night after night, through the longest hours when no one else was there. And that woman had passed on the only thing she still had left to give, a melody without words and without a name, rising and then falling gently at the end of each phrase. Maeve Marsh brought it home and whistled it in her little kitchen, never knowing whose melody it had been. Before their children ever met in a dark hallway, their 2 mothers had already met in a hospital room. The following spring, there was a window overlooking the quiet channel, the water shining silver beneath the sunlight, barges passing slowly, as though nothing had ever happened there. The ring had been resized to fit her finger, and for the first time it was no longer loose. At dock number 4, a night school scholarship bearing the name Maeve Marsh was established for laborers, drivers, and cleaning staff, and the first person to receive it was Micah Pell. Delaney stood by the window in the sunlight, holding her little boy, Ellis Kane, in her arms, and she whistled the melody again, slowly, each note full and clear, and the child burst into laughter before answering with his own clumsy little humming sound deep in his throat. Emmett stood in the doorway watching mother and son, and he didn't say anything, because some things are simply too large to be spoken aloud. This story leaves us with something very simple. There are people who believe everyone has a price, that with enough money or enough power, any human being can be bought. But a person's dignity doesn't live in the title printed beside their name on a payroll sheet. And it doesn't live in the balance of a bank account. It lives in whether they are willing to hold on to the truth when holding on to it comes at a cost. And the most frightening thing in this story was never the freezing water. It was 40 decent people standing on the shore and choosing to look away. The silence of good people always costs more than we imagine. But those same 40 people eventually stepped into the water. And that reminds us that it is never too late for one person to step out of line. And that once one person does, the others may find their courage too. Be kind to the people who serve us every day. The people whose names we so rarely remember. Because the kindness you plant today may return to save you on the day you need it most. Just as a dock worker stepped into freezing water for someone because of a hospital bill he had never even known had been paid for him. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with someone you love, so that together we can listen to more compelling stories every day. How do you feel about Delaney and Emmett's story? What part of it made you think the most? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each and every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.